Going on, everybody? Welcome back to the podcast. Welcome into another episode of the Triple Play Fantasy Podcast. A proud member of Underdog and the Underdog Fantasy family. And if you use code TRIPLE over at Underdog, you'll get a deposit match up to $100 using that code as a first-time depositor. And now is the best time to go over there as it's prime best ball season. So you can check out the Pit Bull, the Chihuahua, the Puppy, the Golden. So many great drafts over there right now. So go check out Underdog Fantasy today. We are back. For those watching on YouTube, we have Doc in the house joining me tonight, along with a special guest. Doc, how you doing?
Doing pretty well. I wanted to just give it to the special guest, though. I don't want to keep the people in anticipation.
I was curious how you're doing as well, Doc. I was wondering. And by the way, before the show, when we were talking, Doc said, hey, you can call me Doc, you can call me Eric, which is my legal name. It's up to you. What would you prefer? And I settled on Doc just because, we're talking about, I don't have that many Docs in my life. So now, after your own brother refers to you as Doc, it is set in stone. Forevermore, you are Doc to me and to the world.
Oh my gosh. We're really going to get this name out there where people are going to think it's my legal name.
That's right. Well, for those that don't recognize that voice, let me intro this man in the proper way. We welcome in a man who I would call the Mike Evans of fantasy analysts. Why, you may ask? Because he's as consistent as you can get. As you know, this man year in and year out will give you 1,000 plus metaphorical yards of great fantasy analysis. He's also host of ESPN's Fantasy Focus Football podcast. And since we last talked with him, he's now an NFL draft analyst for ESPN. He can be in the studio, he could be on location or on the golf course, and he knows how to bring it. One of the only people who understand the struggle that Doc and I receive being carded at over 30 years of age. It is Field Yates. How's it going, man?
Hey, I'm doing great. And first of all, when you started with that Mike Evans analogy, I'm thinking to myself, Mike's kind of old. Like, I think I saw some gray hairs in that beard this offseason. If Mendy's trying to call me an old fart, I'm not ready for that yet, man. But you brought it all the way back around, including noting that the three of us are part of the often carded club. So I'm a proud card-carrying member, because the card in this case is your actual driver's license, because you have to bring it around because you're constantly getting carded, even though I'm now the tender age of 37 years old. I don't like saying that out loud, but I just did. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, I saw when Schefter put that out there, and I was like, come on. I mean, we're all young looking, but to be carded, I thought that was a little extra. Was there like a crazy backstory with that, or is it just she just asked for your license and didn't trust that you were 21?
Yeah, I think that probably when you work at a casino, you err on the side of caution, right? Which is, so we're not going to a casino. We were walking through the casino in Detroit. They have this, it's in Greektown. And there are a lot of things that you can access by just walking through the casino and the hotel, rather than walking several blocks around it, which, even if the NFL draft wasn't going on, would be a long walk. But because the draft was taking place, as you guys can imagine, the city was like basically totally reconstructed, right? They had all these auxiliary sets that were put up. So like there was a Starbucks that every morning I tried to go to, or the first morning I woke up there, I tried to go to. I saw on my app, it was like a 0.4 mile walk, which is fairly reasonable, even though it was cold when we first arrived to Detroit. And then by the time I actually got there, having walked around so many different things that barricaded the normal route, I'd walk like a mile and a half. So that was the end of my Starbucks walk experience in Detroit. But anyways, we're going through this casino to cut off a big significant portion of the walk. And Shefty walked through without any issue. And then I got up there and she asked me for my ID. It happened to be on my 37th birthday, which was draft week. So I got a kick out of it. I thought it was actually a cool moment. It was funny. And I truly I'm not trying to sound like a mensch here. That's a fairly unenviable situation when you are responsible. Like if I were 19 and I walked in there, she didn't card me, and then I did something illegal, she might be liable or culpable for my presence in the casino. So I now have found that more and more establishments that require carding just card everybody. They just card every single person. I don't care if you're 97 or 27, you're going to get carded. So I certainly don't blame those that opt for that strategy instead.
Is there a certain age that people think you are? So like you're 37, but if people are like, oh, I thought you were 30 or 32.
It's funny. We had a babysitter come over for our two kids somewhat recently, and she told me she thought I was 28. And I said, you know something? I'm cool with that. And I hope that nobody ever guesses a number different than that. Like, I want to be 56 looking 28, right? I don't know. Part of me was like, I don't want to look 23. That might be a little bit too young. But I also, something about being in my 30s is like kind of daunting. So 28 is the number that I would like everybody to guess going forward, even though I've already spilled the beans. I don't know what it is, but I have a rule. I made this rule up in my 30s, is that this is important for everybody out there to know. You say early, mid, late 20s, 30s, etc. The earlies are defined as the years 0 through 7. So if you're 30, you're in your early 30s. If you're 37, you're still in your early 30s. The middle 30s, mid 30s is just the 8 year, 38. So when I'm 38 next year, I'll be in my mid 30s. Late 30s will be 39. That's how it works across all decades. I actually did make that rule up. Don't question it. That's how the rule works.
I love it. I love it. Well, Field, we've had you on here. I think we've talked food. We've talked beer.
Yeah.
We've just talked about life.
Yeah.
I was trying to think of a way to do something different, as I try to do when you've graciously have come on each time. And I said, let's bring it back to beer, because you know craft beers and you are very familiar with your beers. But let's also put the fantasy spin to it here. And so right now, for those that have been living under a rock, it is the summer of beer games. You have the Kelsey Beer Bowl. You have the Bussin' Beer Olympics, the Barstool Beer Games. So we thought Triple Play could be the first fantasy football and beer games crossover. So how does it work for those listening or watching? It's kind of it's hard to explain, but that's how a lot of the drinking games are anyway. So let's
just go along with it. You'll figure it out. Crack a beer and come along for the ride. You'll have a good time.
Exactly. I couldn't have said it any better. So let's start off with the first game, one that I think most people are familiar with, beer pong, the staple of any beer games. There's a lot that goes into the game besides shooting the ping pong ball into the cup. For those that know, there's something called a bounce shot, which if you are able to land a bounce shot, you get 2 cups. And so for fantasy, I would like to think of who Field in fantasy football is going to be the bounce shot. Who's going to surprise people in fantasy and be that potential sleeper this year?
Man, there are so much. Let me start here. And I've had this conversation recently on my own show. So if you've heard Fantasy Focus recently, I'll reiterate that. It's okay, by the way. Lots of stuff is said on multiple different platforms. But I think the word sleeper has some different definition depending on who you're speaking to. And here's the reason why. When I first cracked into the industry 10 or 12 years ago, what it meant to be a sleeper was like a player that the common football fan had just never heard of, like literally never heard of. Like, oh, the Saints' third wide receiver. I never heard of that guy. You're telling me he could be pretty good? Yes, I am. So there's a different definition of sleeper now, and it's totally subjective. How you and I define sleepers could be very, very different. Here's an example. Like every name that I throw your way, you're like, yeah, I've heard of that guy. Like I've drafted him already on 2 teams. I roster him. I've snagged him in 5 best ball drafts, right? So I think that there's a little bit of a subjective nature to the term sleeper. So I tend to find guys that I think could have some value, but I also acknowledge that it's very rare for a player to be a sleeper who's also going to wind up having season-long value that's on our radar right now. Puka Nakuas are Puka Nakuas because that's what makes, like, they don't come around very often because, like, we are trying to find the next Puka Nakua as if something like this exists frequently, and it simply does not, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't have a good answer for this year's Puka Nakua. If I had the answer, I'd have the guy ranked a whole lot higher than I currently do. Here's an example, though, of a name that I think is worth a late-round flyer, and I'll explain why. It's Trey Benson, Cardinals running back. And yes, James Conner is a starter. James Conner has also never finished a full season, 16 or 17 games. As of course, he's been playing since before there were 17 games in a regular season. But if Trey Benson gets a shot, and it may not be for 17 games, it probably won't be for 17 games, but if he gets a shot for 4 or 5 games, you're going to have a player that I think will have top 20 value. So I have decided that, like, sleepers don't have to be guys that you can add on the waiver wire right away after week 1, and he can help carry you to a fantasy torch the entire season. I think of sleepers as guys who might only have 4 or 5 weeks of value, 2 or 3 weeks of value. Because as we know, late season value tends to matter more in championship pursuits than early season value. That's kind of a tangent. It's a long tangent, actually. But Trey Benson is a name that I like in late rounds that I found myself gravitating towards very frequently.
Yeah, Trey Benson was ranked in the top 10 his last 2 collegiate seasons in breakaway percentage. He also was in the top 50 in elusive rating per PFF. I think he's a great ad. Now, the question, just to spin this on off field, someone like Trey Benson, if you draft James Conner early, is it a must to go grab Trey Benson in your mind?
I don't think so. Yeah, I don't, the insurance policy backs, it's a healthy debate about whether you should be using a roster spot on a player that's the backup to one of your top running backs, whether there's value in drafting a backup to somebody else's top running back, right? So if somebody else took James Conner in the 7th round, is it worth you using a 13th round pick? My stance on that is this. If the option is to choose between, unless you have a guy who's got, and James Conner, yes, he's never played a full 17-game season, but he's also been pretty close to it recently, right? It's not like James Conner is consistently missing 8 or 9 or 10 games. But if you have a player who's consistently missing huge chunks of time, then yes, his backup should be your priority. But when it's 2 guys who have relatively similar injury risk, I lean toward, and the options are, do I take that guy's true backup or do I take a backup for somebody else? I take the player who I think is better, right? So if it's Trey Benson versus Ty Chandler in Minnesota, right? Mm-hmm. He's the ostensible backup to Aaron Jones. Jones, like James Conner, a bit older. I think Trey Benson's a better player. So if I have my choice between those 2 guys, I prefer Trey Benson, even if Ty Chandler may see the field and Benson may not see the field as much because something happens to Aaron Jones as opposed to James Conner. I can't control that. So right now, late July, that's my stance on 2 players to that effect.
Phil, like do you let contractual situation at all kind of like lean one way or another? James Conner on the last year of his deal, unrestricted free agent, will be 30 years old. Aaron Jones just signed, I think, a 3 or 4 year deal. Does that kind of factor in at all?
I do. So there are some situations that involve contracts where I do factor them in, and I'm seeing it now. We're actually in the midst of, right after I do this with you guys, I'm headed back on to our mock draft project at ESPN, which is something we've been doing for close to a month now. We've been drafting a ton. And what I'm seeing is there are certain players that I might need to adjust my ranks on because they just keep like soaring or sinking. And one player keeps sinking is T. Higgins. And T. Higgins is scary in the way, not to the same degree, but scary in the way that Justin Jefferson was scary in some ways last year as the number 1 overall pick. T. Higgins is competitive. T. Higgins wants to be out there. If you're on the final year of your contract, or if you are on the franchise tag, or if you're extension eligible, as was the case with Justin Jefferson last year without that new deal, human nature is going to kick in. If your hamstring's tight, you're not going to risk it. You just aren't. So I'm seeing that there are players, I think a player this year in T. Higgins who is shifting downwards more and more and more in drafts because people are saying, well, what if he twists his ankle in week 1? Is he going to be back, when he's back to 70%? Or is he going to say, I have to look out for me, myself. I'm T. bleeping Higgins. If I'm a free agent, I'm making $25, $30 million a year. If I'm not back to week 5 because I'm not 100% until week 5, so be it. So that's where I bring the contracts into play. I thought a sneaky one that never got there because they ended up agreeing to a deal. But Christian McCaffrey, he was not at OTAs for a while in San Francisco. I don't know this, but given the fact that he's been a consistent presence there in the past, I at least considered the possibility that CMC wanted a new deal, and that was part of the reason why he was not at OTAs. He got a new deal. He ended up showing up. Everything is moot. It's the summer of CMC in a lot of ways. Madden cover, got married, got the new contract, etc. That I'm glad that one did not fester any longer because I didn't want to have to deal with for the 2nd straight year the number 1 player in my overall rankings. That's where Jefferson was at this time last year, potentially being the conversation surrounding a contract every single day.
And then it was always left was Brandon Ayuk in the Niners and needs that contract.
Well, that's a good one too. Yeah, another good one. Totally.
So another shot that you take in beer pong,
the
celeb shot. This is usually someone you trust, or a ride or die, if you will. Someone that you know is good and you can trust. So Field, is there a player, aka your ride or died, or someone that you would trust to deliver fantasy prominence this season? Who would that be for you?
Yeah, I got two. It's Anthony Richardson and it's Marvin Harrison Jr., right? So I think the criteria for this is like, I'm not going to take Christian McCaffrey, right? That's like too obvious. Okay. I'm also not going to take a guy like, I'm just totally like, I'm not going to say like Rome Odunze, right? Who I love as a player, but like Rome Odunze, probably the third wide receiver for the Bears, like with a rookie quarterback as well. I think he's going to be a useful player, but like he might have the Jackson Smith and Jigba year, which he was solid for Seattle last year, but there were games in which they just didn't need him that much when you have DK and Tyler Lockett. Anyways, so I think those guys thread the needle. They're in between. And I've seen this debate recently because I've been all in on Anthony Richardson and Marv since we started talking about fantasy a whole lot more after the draft. And now one of the pieces of pushback is like, well, they're going too early in my drafts. I don't want to take them. And I'm like, I understand why that's happening. It's happening in part because people are talking about them with more confidence, right? So the more that you hear about Marvin Harrison Jr. as a potential top 10 wide receiver, the more likely it is for him to be going ahead of Devontae Adams or Chris Olave or Michael Pittman Jr. or Garrett Wilson even. That's how these things work, right? ADP is a byproduct. It's like mock drafts, right? Mock drafts in the real draft, like they do shape where guys go because teams are saying, well, hey, if no one's saying that Ladd McConkey is going to go in the first round and I have picked 25, and we really want a wide receiver and, the team at 29 is calling up to say, hey, we want to trade up, we can probably move down from 25 to 29 and still get Ladd McConkey if we want him there. So Richardson and Harrison, I'm all in on. With Richardson, the pushback seems to be twofold. One, the injuries, totally fair and valid. I find that every player is an injury risk every single season. I think there's a chance he was unlucky last year. And then the throwing skills. I'm not sure the throwing needs to be that great for him to be great. I mean, we've all watched Justin Fields take over the NFL for a month. Remember 2 years ago, for a month straight, he was the best player in fantasy football. He wasn't a good passer. I think Richardson has the capacity to be a much better thrower than Justin in time, but he doesn't need to be that great this year. If he just rushes the football 165 times this season, that would be a ton. It would be amazing. It'll probably yield 1,000 yards and maybe 8 or 9 touchdowns. And then Marv, I just don't want to overthink it, guys. I know people say, well, he hasn't done it yet. No kidding. Neither are Puka Nacua until last year, or Saquon Barkley until his rookie year in New York, right? This is a projection game. So the data points from the past are very helpful. But I also like to look ahead and say, every year we have a million surprises. And oftentimes the reason why those things are surprises is because they haven't happened before. So I'm not simply going to lean on what's taken place in the past to justify what could happen in the future.
Field, I think it's a mistake to let Marvin Harrison Jr. out of the first round unless you have the back-to-back pick at the end of a 12-team league, the 12-30. That's how I felt about him going in, because he's going into an offense that has Trey McBride and him as the top two weapons. But I love Greg Dortch. Don't get me wrong. He's my guy. But there are, in terms of target share and in terms of draft capital, in terms of the talent coming in, which they say he's arguably one of the best receiving prospects we've seen in the last decade. I just feel, and then you have a competent quarterback in Kyler Murray that's shown that he can get his targets the ball, as he did with DeAndre Hopkins a couple of years ago. I feel like this reminds me of the Ezekiel Elliott rookie year when he was in Dallas.
Ooh, I like that. The stars align, right?
And I think by the end of draft season, he got up to the end of the first round. And to me, that's like, it's like, don't overthink it. It's like, yeah, he's a rookie, but he's going into the perfect situation for him to succeed. And I feel like that's kind of this case with Marvin Harrison Jr. So I love that pick.
Yeah, so I kind of have two minds, because I've been seeing him go like maybe closer to like 17 to 22, 23 range is where I've often seen him. So maybe like mid-second in a 12-team league, or late second, early third in a 10-team league. And so, and Mike Clay, is the absolute best. Love the man with my entire heart, and is such a great fantasy analyst. Him and I have had some debates about this, because one of the reasons why he's been fading Anthony Richardson in our mock draft project is because Richardson's going so early. And so he's like, I don't have an issue with you having Richardson as like a top, 3 or 4 or 5 quarterback. It's the problem is that if you can get Richardson, if you get Lamar Jackson 3 rounds behind Anthony Richardson, isn't that valuable? It is. It totally is. The reality is that if I play in one fantasy football league, then I'm going to do the very pragmatic things consistently in my draft, right? So I probably won't take Marvin Harrison 12th or 13th in my draft if I only play in one league, because I could take very easily A.J. Brown right there and get, comparable players and still get more value, so to speak. When you play in 20 leagues, guys, sometimes you do what you feel like doing. Right? And so you can get caught into a trap. Like, hey, I don't have any Anthony Richardson and I'm 9 out of 20 drafts in. I don't want to wait any longer. So if I have to take Richardson in the 4th round, yeah, it's early. But if he goes off the board as QB3 in this draft or QB2 in this draft, I don't care. So I think that's always an important thing for people who are listening to podcasts to keep in mind is that if you're in one, first of all, shout out to the people that are in just one league and listening to a ton of content, because that's obviously dedication. But also, you can do things differently, right? It's not that dissimilar to anything in life where you've got a variety of shots versus one shot. That's just kind of how things go.
Yeah.
My whole thing with rushing quarterbacks is once Tim Tebow proved he was fantasy viable in 2011, like you said, you don't have to be a great NFL quarterback to be a great fantasy one.
Not even close. Yeah, you just have to be. If you can run, it's a cheat code. I believe, and I have given Scott credit for this recently. So if it wasn't Scott Barrett who crunched the numbers on this, I apologize to who it was. And Scott, you can take credit for it as far as I'm concerned. But at one point in the past few years, he had crunched the numbers and found that every target for a running back was worth about 2.4 carries, right? Is the equivalent of. I don't know if a similar research has been done to equate one passing attempt to one rushing attempt for a quarterback. But I would bet for every Josh Allen rushing attempt or Jalen Hurts rushing attempt or Lamar Jackson rushing attempt or Anthony Richardson rushing attempt, right? That might be, or it might take 3 passing attempts or 2 passing attempts to equate to that, right? So maybe it's 2.5, 3.5. I don't know the exact number. The point is that quarterbacks that can rush are a cheat code in fantasy football. We're seeing that with, I think, running backs that have a ton of receiving upside, same vein there. So it's why Jaden Daniels is so compelling is, if you're going to be patient, he's one of the best values at quarterback potentially because he's not a good runner. He's not a great runner. He's an elite runner. He's a guy that I think is in the same breadth as Justin Fields as a rushing quarterback. That's how special he was at LSU and should be at the NFL level as well.
Yeah, I think that's why people have talked about, I've seen people tweeting that if he's outside your top 12, you're going to regret that because of that floor that you're talking about, the rushing floor that's there. And then if he develops any type of passing at the NFL level, which he did show in college that he is a capable passer, he could be, I don't want to say this year's Anthony Richardson because Anthony Richardson is this year's Anthony Richardson, but there is a lot of ceiling there with him. In terms of Anthony Richardson, he had 2 top QB4. If he was 2 times in the top 4 in quarterback finishes in those 4 weeks, and he averaged the most fantasy points per snap of any quarterback last year. So to go with your point there, Field, the last in this game,
it's a projection. It's a projection, right? I keep hijacking what we were going to talk about, but why I'm optimistic on Richardson is that I think there's a chance at the end of the season, we're talking about him in the same way we talked about Jalen Hurts, who 4 games down the stretch as a rookie, showed some stuff, was kind of a question mark as a passer, and then took off. And I regretted not being more optimistic on Jalen Hurts. So I see similar seeds. And if ranking him as a 3rd-rated quarterback and drafting him a couple rounds early might not be the best business in draft strategy, I'm okay with it because if the result is what I forecast it to be, I don't think anybody's going to regret paying the premium on a guy who could be a top 3 quarterback this season.
I 100% agree. The last one in this particular beer pong game, if you miss a shot and it bounces back to you, you take the behind the back shot, a Hail Mary, if you will. Which potential player at the end of your draft do you think fits this category? I'll give you a name that stuck out for me, like Dontavian Wicks is someone I feel like that in a 12-team league, normal home league draft, he's probably going to be someone taken in the last couple rounds that I think could be that Hail Mary and could end up being the Packers wide receiver to potentially roster for your fantasy teams this year. Do you have one in mind, Field?
So I want people to remember that when you're saying a Hail Mary and you process the name, the first part of the reaction is sort of like, and then kind of the light bulb goes off for you, right? The light switch is flipped. It's Brock Bowers for me. And your first reaction is, wait, hold on. Devontae Adams, Jacoby Myers, Michael Mayer, quarterback's a big question mark. Antonio Pierce wants to run the football. And then you're like, wait, the Raiders had the 13th pick in the draft. They had a bunch of other needs they could have filled. offensive line, could have drafted a pass rusher, any number of positions they could have taken. And instead they took Brock Bowers, who might have been the only team that nobody mocked him to go to, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a reminder, Brock Bowers was freaking good. I know Kyle Pitts, has become a bit radioactive in the world of fantasy football, right? But the kind of prospect Kyle was regarded as coming into the league is what we're talking about with Brock Bowers. And by the way, Kyle Pitts became the second rookie tight end ever to have 1,000 receiving yards. So maybe the idea is like, you know what? I get it. Davante Adams might get 165 targets. There might be room, though, for Brock Bowers to have 112 targets this season. Is that what 17 times 6 is? 16 times 6? I'm not a math guy. I think it's 17 times 6, if I'm not mistaken. But in any event, I'm trying to get at the idea of him having 7 targets per game. And he's such a special player at a position where it's really hard to find guys, right? And so that's my Hail Mary is I get it. There are a lot of factors sort of working against Brock Bowers. But when you're taking a guy in the 14th or 15th round, who cares? If the pick stinks after 2 weeks, you're going to the waiver wire anyways. Who cares? I tell people, we get so bent out of shape on rounds like 10, 11, 12, 13. Like, it doesn't matter. I mean, if you hit on them, it's great, right? But like, there's so many ways, there's so much recourse if you don't hit on those mid to late round picks. And if you're timely with your waiver wire strategy, like you can definitely make up for a couple of high risk, high reward picks later in your draft.
Well, I think too with him, he's at his floor kind of hype right now. Like, let's say Davante Adams got traded. His name has been floated around in trade rumors.
Yeah.
And it's not a swap for Ayuk, but they trade him to the Jets for future picks. Now his ADP is going to go up. So this is right now probably the worst it could be.
Totally. And by the way, right now it looks uncertain as to who the quarterback is going to be going into the season. But maybe somebody like actually shines. Like maybe one of Gardner Minshew or Aiden O'Connell looks pretty good. And by the way, I'm taking note of Davante Adams' confidence in Aiden O'Connell. I don't share it yet, but Davante knows more about football than I'll ever know. So if he likes Aiden O'Connell, it kind of has my attention. Like maybe O'Connell will show more. Maybe it was the putrid offensive line. Maybe it was just being a rookie last year. Maybe there was a bunch of factors. But hopefully the passing game is more competent because they do have, I think, 3 awesome weapons, Davante being the best, of course, by far. But Jacoby Myers was a stud last year early in the season. And then I think Brock Bowers is the real deal.
Phil, I'll get you out of here on this. Is there any other names that you've talked about? I listened to you guys' pod, so forgive me if I'm forgetting a name that you've talked about there a couple times. But are there any other names that come to mind of must-draft players for your players that you've been trying to get in as many drafts as possible?
So I've talked, Marv, we talked about Anthony Richardson. We've talked about, there's kind of like this interesting sort of sweet spot of running backs that are going like as late RB2s that end up like leading to a baby gap after that. So it's like David Montgomery or Ramondre Stevenson, James Conner territory. Then there's a little bit of a gap. And a player that I found myself taking as my RB3 or taking as my second running back when I've loaded it up on pass catchers is DeAndre Swift. Who that's a bit of the, we talked earlier about the, the idea of contract and how much it comes into play. And it's like, I think DeAndre Swift is good. I think he's talented. He's really talented. He's obviously often not sort of met expectations, but he goes to Chicago with a quarterback that can throw the football to a running back often, which that was just not part of Philly's recipe. That was not their menu was not to throw the football at running backs often. It just hasn't been since Jalen Hurts was their quarterback. We'll see if that changes with Saquon. But DeAndre Swift got 3 years, $24 million. Like, to me, notable enough that I thought like they have a plan there. Now they got a lot of pass catchers, but one running back, usually it's going to be just one running back on the field. And if that's DeAndre Swift for 60+% of the snaps, might be a decent value there.
Yeah, I think so too. And his draft price isn't too bad. I did hear the other day, was it on Hard Knocks that they said the Giants were signing between him and Singletary?
Saquon. Yeah. Oh, I thought it was Saquon too, right? Because weren't they saying that the Giants were saying that the Bears are driving the price up on Saquon? They didn't know if it was real or not.
Okay, that's what it was. Yeah, I thought
But Singletary also, yeah.
Yeah. But it's interesting that $1 million a year was that significant for them to go down to, even though Singletary is a good back, but
he is, man. I got to tell you that one. I fear, like, I hope, it's been so revealing to watch these Hard Knocks during the off season, but that's some raw stuff there, right? And it's the kind of stuff that fans are already enraged about. And Giants fans, if Saquon balls, like I think all three of us think he's going to ball this year, could get a little bit ugly there for the Giants in a hurry.
I think so too. On that note, Field, thank you so much again for coming on the show. I know between family, always football 24/7, and everything else you got going, I really appreciate you taking the time to hang out with us.
As always, I appreciate it. We'll do it again sometime soon. Much respect to the Daddy Day here going on, and let's enjoy the rest of this lovely summer we have on our hands.
That sounds great. Field, the one and only, the legend himself. Make sure you check him out. ESPN, Fantasy Focus Podcast. Anything else in the summer that is going on that you're doing?
Yeah, just trying to hit a drive straight. That would be great.
Oh
if anybody's going to do that,
I thought we were gonna get done with one pod without talking about golf.
Oh, sorry.
No, but with me, that's gonna happen. I'm always gonna talk
dang
golf.
it. We were on the 1 yard line. I totally screwed it up. My bad.
Oh my God.
Field, you are the best, my friend. Thank you again so much for your time, man.